And
hello, welcome everyone. We are so happy to be with you right now to chat about this really wonderful book by Ron Lieber, and I will introduce him, and then we will be chatting between us for a little while, and then we can dive into your questions. There is a module that you can press to enter your questions, and Ron will answer as many of them as we can during this time. So Ron Lieber is the author of The Price You Pay for College and The Opposite of Spoiled, which is another great book and a good one to read at some point as you're raising your kids and thinking about these conversations about money, how to think about that with them. He's the Your Money columnist for the New York Times, and 2 of his books have been New York Times bestsellers. He's the 3-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, which is business journalism's highest honor. And he lives in Brooklyn with his wife, New York Times reporter Jodi Kantor, and their 2 daughters. And one of them is a new kindergartner this year, is that right? And the other is a teenager in high school. So we know that at least one of them is benefiting immediately from this book, and maybe the long-term planning for the next one is going to benefit from this book. I have a 12-year-old 6th grader who has been home for 420 days, not that I'm counting, and doing pandemic homeschool. And this has been an important year for financial literacy for him, and also learning about research skills. And for me, reading this book, which I was lucky enough to get before the end of 2020 as a pre-read, actually, I started a 529, Ron. So you changed my son's life. Thank you. Because I had always believed the kind of myth that was exposed in this book that if you don't save, there's a reward at the end, especially if you're counting on a lot of financial aid. And I believe that because, in fact, I worked in higher ed for many years, and I saw a lot of different things. And I think I also absorbed that because I was working with people who were going to get those discounts. And I love, Ron, that you talk about how like wealthy parents probably shouldn't throw their weight around with, mid-level admissions officers who make $65,000 or $75,000 a year and sort of, woe is me about my $250,000 salary and my, $500,000, $1 million home, because they might not get a lot of love from that person. I really appreciated that plug for those of us who worked in higher ed, but also because we get some really hefty discounts in higher ed, and I'm not in that world anymore. So I needed to change my thinking. So your book really, really helped me. I want to start by asking a question about merit aid. So one of the great examples you used was a college that actually had a year where they were sort of boasting to their colleagues and peers that everyone got a merit scholarship. And this feels a little bit like the soccer game where everyone gets a trophy at the end. So can you tell me about merit aid and how is it possible for everyone to be that meritorious? And what should we do if our kids get merit offers? How do we evaluate that?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for hosting us here. And a huge tip of the cap to Barbara's Bookstore, which has been a part of my life since I was a wee one. I grew up at Pine Grove in Addison, 5 blocks east of Wrigley's Field, right around the corner from Unabridged Bookstore, another great indie. But Barbara's, the nearest one, at least, was not that far away on Wells. I think that was the original location. And it's always been a part of my life and my world and a part of my browsing habit. So it's just an absolute thrill to be here. So merit aid, I guess let's take a step back and, sort of define our terms here. So when I was a kid in Chicago and we did not have enough money for the schools that I wanted to go to, I was applying for financial aid, and it was just kind of a straight up thing, right? You filled out this thing called the FAF form, the precursor to the FAFSA. Which people fill out today when they apply for financial aid. And this form of financial aid was all about financial need. It was need-based aid. And need-based aid depended mostly on what you earned and a little bit on what you had, your assets, right? Your savings, maybe your home equity, depending on the institution. So that was then, the late 80s. To the extent that there were what was known back then as academic scholarships, they were sort of few and far between, and they didn't really exist at the more selective schools. Now, here's what happened. In the 1990s, right after I went to college, you, I know, are at least 20 years younger than me, right? So,
I went to college in the 1990s.
You may have actually benefited from some of this, or at least the beginnings of it. I'm going to take you back to the state of Ohio in the 1990s. So here was what was going on in Ohio. Ohio is a very competitive higher education market, as is Illinois, as is Wisconsin, Minnesota. The Midwest is chock full of really great smaller undergraduate institutions, small liberal arts colleges and smaller universities. Ohio was particularly competitive at the time. The Ohio State University, largest undergraduate institution in America at the time, thriving system. Miami of Ohio is also part of the public system there, another great school, much smaller. And then there's just a whole bunch of smaller private colleges and universities in Ohio. And, you know, we've grown used to, as parents of this era, thinking of ourselves as sort of supplicants in this system where we're, you know, begging for admission and we're begging for money and we're begging for spare change. But in fact, right. But in fact, this is a viciously competitive market where, you know, below the, you know, sort of Northwestern University of Chicago part of the market where, you know, there are, in fact, 10 people applying for every one or two who get in. A lot of these schools are really kind of struggling to make their numbers each year. And this was already going on in the state of Ohio. And down, you know, closer to the bottom of the food chain, the less selective private institutions, there's a school called Ohio Wesleyan that was having a real problem. It had once been a reasonably serious academic institution, but it had sort of developed a well-earned reputation for hard partying, intense athletics, and not particularly serious academics. The faculty were enraged. Alumni were upset and not donating as much because, you know, the institution's brand was being tarnished. School had to do something about it. So it decided it was going to go out and buy themselves a whole bunch of better students. It's going to go out and buy teenagers. So how did it do that? Well, here's what happened. They went and they bought up a bunch of names of teenagers who had done really well on the PSATs, you know, better than average for the Ohio Wesleyan students of the age. And it wrote them letters and it said, please come apply to Ohio Wesleyan, come visit here, you know, we'll show you a good time, but not that good, right? You can apply without paying an application fee. And if you get in, we'll give you $3,000, right, per year, guaranteed, all 4 years that you're here, right? And that was enticing enough that Ohio Wesleyan won way more than its usual fair share of, you know, face-offs and bake-offs in March and April, you know, between them and College of Worcester in Ohio and Denison University in Ohio. So College of Worcester and Denison figured out what was happening, right? Ohio Wesleyan was buying away a whole bunch of students. It was really working. So Worcester and Denison were like, well, we can do that too, right? And it worked for them. Right. So after
we have these people to thank for like the landfill of mail that seniors and juniors get. Right.
I mean, right. If you're wondering why so much of this goes on, right, it turns out that making teenagers feel good about themselves and patting their parents on their heads and throwing money at everybody and saying, you know, your kid is meritorious actually makes a difference. Right. And so Kenyon and Case Western started to get annoyed because Worcester and Denison were stealing more than their fair share of students. And pretty soon they had to fold and start offering this too. And then Oberlin, which sort of thought it was above it all, kind of held its nose and jumped into the pool as well. Because what else was it going to do, right? I mean, it was bleeding students to these competitive institutions that were throwing money around. And this money, what came to be known as merit aid, this money has nothing to do with what you earn or what you have and everything to do with what you've done and who you are. Right. So definitely, you know, equity questions here around you know, fairness. Right now, if you ask Oberlin says, well, look, you know, if we discount $75,000, which is the rack rate today, down to $55,000, we get a whole bunch more, you know, revenue from, you know, a large number of $55,000 students than we would from the way fewer number of $75,000 students who would come if we didn't offer the discount. And then we can take 55,000 times, you know, 1,200 people, and we can use that to cross-subsidize a whole bunch of people who don't have very much, right?
And
so that's a little bit
I love
how the math might works.
how you dive deeply into like some of these Ohio schools like Worcester and, some of these other schools, because it really is so granular and complex. And the Ohio market is a great example of how the schools do play against each other. Even schools that you might not think, like very few of the same students would probably want to go to an Ohio State and an Oberlin, and yet they're competing with one another. And then you really blew my mind with need blind. Like, aren't schools need blind? I thought that was a sacred truth, that schools were, nonprofit schools, all but the for-profit bad guys were, need blind. But no.
No. So again, right, when you apply for admission, you want to have, you want your kid to have the best possible chance of getting in. But it turns out that, only a handful of dozen institutions are what's known as need blind, which means they don't care whether you're applying for financial aid or not. And they're not going to evaluate you for admission based on whether you need money or not. Now, some of the ones that are need blind will let you in, but then, without regard to your need, but then they may not meet all of what's known as your demonstrated needs. So that can feel a little bit like a bait and switch, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're not going to look at your capacity to pay, but then once you're in, they may lowball you on the discounts, right? And then you're sort of in a pickle. Then you've got to decide whether you want to borrow to make up the difference, right? And so it turns out that there are all sorts of, extremely selective, highly regarded institutions that are what's known as need aware, right? So the first 75% of the class gets filled without any attention paid to ability to pay. But then they get towards the end and they've kind of hit their budget, right? They can't give out any more discounts. And then you start to have an edge if you're a full pay student. So that's what's known as need aware. So, the golden, the schools that are the most generous are the ones that are need blind. They guarantee to meet all of your need, and they do it without asking you to take out any loans. And that's, maybe 10 or 15 schools. And
a lot of those schools are super hard to get into, right? So those are not your school for your, sort of B student with average extracurriculars are not probably looking at some of those schools. So, is that the gap that you talked about? Not to be confused with gap years, but the gapping in financial aid.
Yeah. If you've ever heard the word gapping, what that refers to is, if you get into a school and the school's own financial aid award, or the thing known as its net price calculator, which every school needs to have on its website. You can go, to any school, right? You just Google Lawrence University net price calculator. You can input all of your data, and it'll tell you if you got in about how much of a discount you might be offered to try and, entice you up there to Wisconsin. But what happens with gapping is that you get your financial aid award. And what it tells you is that, okay, yes, we've decided that, even though our list price is $50,000 a year, you can really only afford to pay 28. But all we're going to give you is a $10,000 scholarship, right? So that leaves you with a $12,000 gap that you've got to fill up with loans. So
and that doesn't feel times 4, right? It's
12 times 4, right?
4 years.
Plus the list price is going to, the rack rate's going to continue to go up. And so that's your gap, right? And you've got to decide how much you're willing to borrow, because students, in most instances, cannot borrow more than about $31,000 over the course of the 4 years.
Right. So those of us who waited a little later in life to have kids and are looking at retiring when our kids maybe are in college, and we're looking at that kind of gap, it's like we would be borrowing at maybe a really bad time. These are some real questions. And so what you should do is rewind the script, have your kids right after college so you have more time to save. But hopefully when you don't have debt of your own from college that you're paying back.
Right. This is all stuff that, nobody anticipated when we started conducting, one of the biggest economic experiments we've ever, we've ever engaged in as a nation, using 17 and 18-year-olds as our guinea pigs, as our test subjects. It's you
mean those 17 and 18-year-olds that credit cards are now marketing to aren't marketed to are not the most financially literate people walking the earth?
Well, so this is the thing. I'm so glad you brought that up because in our wisdom, right, from a regulatory perspective, 10 or 12 or 14 years ago, some new laws that were passed to make it impossible for teenagers to get credit cards without a grown-up cosigner. But undergraduate student loans, we'll give those to 17 and 18-year-olds all day long. And now we're up to 1.7 trillion with a T, $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. It's now hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars higher than either credit card debt or auto debt. And we've managed to do this in the space of, less than a generation, without anybody really much talking about it until now. Right now, we're having more of a national conversation about it, and it's pretty clear that the Biden administration feels like it's a third rail politically.
Yeah, it's great to see the conversation about it. And I do think that those of us who did pay down our debt can talk about that with more empathy. Like, you occasionally will hear people on Twitter saying like, well, I paid my debt. And I actually only paid my own student loans 3 years ago, when I had a really good year with my last book. And I got a bigger check than I expected in royalties that year. And it was the exact amount that I still owed. And I was like, I'm going to just retire this debt. And I'm going to do it before my kid goes to college. I'm going to do it when he's still in 4th grade. This is amazing. But I think the thought that it wouldn't be good for other people to have this massive debt forgiven, I don't understand that at all. Like, I have every reason to believe that, and we know that young people right now are using, during COVID, when so many parents lost their jobs, like using their debt to support their families and other things. So this is a real crisis that I know goes beyond the scope of the book, but is so crucial. When we think about the gap and the differences that families who maybe can do full pay might face, and some of the advantages of being a full pay family versus a family that knows that they need that knows that they will be scanned by that need awareness, and knows that may disadvantage their kid. If you're on the fence, or think about someone like dealing with early action, should you push? Like, if you're on the fence, are there schools where you might not want to declare your need for financial aid because you just know that you would find a way?
It's tricky, right? Because here's the thing that we can't know. We can't get data on this, in the rear view mirror, at least not in public. And we can't know how school is going to change next year. Basically, what you're asking is, for some fail-safe way to know, well, if I apply to a college and the normal odds of getting in are, like it's, they accept 40% of their applicants, what percentage of the applicants do they accept who need financial aid, right? So that's going to depend on, where they are in their cycle, right? Whether they've busted through all of their budget or not. And then that's going to, and then, where your kid fits into that depends on, whether they would be kind of at the top of this class or closer to the bottom of the class. And that might change from year to year, depending on how competitive the applicant pool is. So the best that you can do in those circumstances is just call, the admissions office and have an honest conversation, or have your counselor do it. If you have a guidance counselor at high school, and just say, look, we're not sure, whether it's worth the lowered odds of admission to declare our desire or our need for financial aid. Another way to do this is, not to apply in year one if you're really worried about it, and then to apply for the 3 years, once you've gotten it.
Although I have heard it's harder to get later on, but needs can change, right?
It can be.
And I really appreciated in the book how you talk about how early action and early decision can be really tricky if you know that you will need to be making a decision, because then you're not really comparing apples to apples at that moment, right? You're in a situation where you're being asked to say yes to a school before you know what the other schools would offer.
Well, so this is the hard part, right? So what we're talking about here is the kind of early application where the institution requires you to make a commitment to come if you get in. It's generally known as early decision, right? And the challenge there, if money is at all a factor for you, is the school is asking me to make a commitment before it has told me what it is that it's going to ask me to pay. To me, that's it takes a lot of chutzpah. And so what are we talking about here? Well, if we're talking about the need-based financial aid we talked about at the outset of this conversation, that's something that's a little bit more predictable. You can fill out a net price calculator ahead of time, and it should tell you within a reasonable band of predictability about how much the school would ask you to pay if you were to get in, and you can hold the school to that. Those net price calculators need to be accurate. But as far as the merit aid goes, let's say you want to apply early decision to McAllister, right, in St. Paul, Minnesota, great school. But you're a family that's not going to qualify for much of any need-based aid, right? Cry you a river, you earn $225,000 a year. Okay, but you can't write the check for $75,000 after taxes to McAllister. No way, no how. And yet McAllister isn't going to give you any predictability on whether your early decision candidate child is going to get a $10,000 per year merit aid offer, 20, 25, right? You just got to sort of throw in and cross your fingers. So why would you do that, right? Why would you be so silly as to, sort of make a commitment and take this pledge and agree to come if you get in? Well, you would do it because the odds of getting in are better during the first round, right? So these are the trade-offs. So,
but then are they disincentivized to sort of buy your love with a merit scholarship, knowing that you love them so much?
Well, right.
It feels a little bit like Tinder.
Yes. So this is the exact problem, right? And so, the bottom line is that these early decision programs are classist, right? They disadvantage people for whom money is not no object. So, my response to a classist system is to basically try and break the system. And to me, this goes like this, right? If the school is unwilling or unable to give you any kind of predictability ahead of time on what it is that you might pay, particularly in terms of, merit aid discounts, and then you don't get the bottom line price that you need, break the commitment. I just don't, the schools can't, shouldn't, and in fact won't hold you to these commitments if the school is not affordable. And you're asking, well, that's pretty bold, right? You're going to do that with your kid? How do you know that? Well, I spent years doing laps the country saying to these, vice presidents of enrollment management, are you really holding people to these commitments if it turns out that the price that you quote them isn't affordable? And they said, no. Right?
Why would your high school?
Why would we do that? And I said, there's all these people on the internet running around saying that you're going to, hold it against next year's kids, or, my high school counselor will excommunicate me or refuse to send any more grades out. And they said, that's silly, right? They said, everybody out there thinks that like we're the kings and the queens sitting on these thrones with all these power. We can't have every single family in Evanston thinking that like McAllister is blacklisting Evanston Township High School. That'd be nuts, right? We can't blacklist New Trier. We can't blacklist Chicago Latin. Are you out of your mind, right? I mean, they just think that's funny, but people work themselves into this sort of level of anxiety and paranoia, which I totally understand, right? This is arguably the biggest financial decision we will ever make. It's very difficult to reverse it if you get it wrong. It involves our precious children. By all means, freak out a little bit, right?
And there's the sticker for the back of the car.
Well, then there's that too, right? So yeah, so freak out.
Our neighbors will know if our kid goes to McAllister. Everyone will know.
Have the facts before you freak out, and just remind yourself that you have some power, in this consumer experience as well.
And speaking of product placement, I should be drinking from a Barbara's mug, and I actually do have one at home, but I'm at my office, so I'm sorry, I'm drinking from my PBS mug, but. You can buy your copy of Ron's book at Barbara's bookstore, and there is a button to use with a green button that you can get 10% off. And if you don't have this book, it will definitely save you money and save you angst and pain. And there's a lot in this book that's actually about how to have conversations, which is a really nice through line from Opposite of Spoiled. There's a lot of just great reporting and inside, talking to financial aid counselors, talking to deans, and helping parents understand kind of how higher ed really works, which I really appreciated. And I learned a lot, even though I went in thinking, well, I know more about higher ed than the average bear. I used to read the Chronicle of Higher Ed all the time when I was looking for a job in higher ed. And, I know a lot about how, what kids actually get, right? Like I was a TA at Northwestern. So I knew that I can tell you that you can pay Northwestern tuition and get a 22-year-old new grad student as one of your kids' teachers, because that was once me.
Not
and
yet.
you can also have,
Heitner.
all kinds of amazing experiences, right? I mean, my students from there are doing very, very well. But I also want to say, so are my former DePaul and my former Lake Forest College students. And in fact, the difference between my sort of the best students I taught at DePaul, Northwestern, and Lake Forest, there is no difference in terms of outcome. Like, the best students at every place have all ended up kicking butt in the world and doing very cool things. And I just think that's something I want to share as a former professor.
Okay, so a question for you. What about, that's a really interesting range of schools. What about the difference in outcome between the average student at each of those places?
It's harder to know, because the kind of student who keeps in touch with their former TA, their former professor, and like writes you and lets you know how they are, that's going to skew in a certain direction. And the person who reaches out on LinkedIn, even after 10 years, to be like, hey, Prof. Heitner, I'm linking in, is those are not the ones who maybe like are in their parents' basement, kind of still figuring it out. But there was a huge class difference. So my Northwestern students were mostly pretty affluent, not all. Some were not, some were not affluent, but many were very affluent. And so they had some advantages. Those that wanted to be in media, for example, could go do those unpaid or low-paid internships. My DePaul students were like bartending at night. Many of them are working their way through in a very different way than the Northwestern students, who maybe had like a college work-study job that was more resume sort of special. The DePaul students, a few of them were a little older too, even like 2 or 3 years older. They weren't necessarily non-traditional student age, but they were a little older. So I think the average students at all of those places also probably do okay, but it's a little different, because if you're average, but you're from Scarsdale or from, the Bay Area, and you have very wealthy parents, there's a cushion for being then average at a school like Northwestern, in terms of like your mom or dad might still be able to hook you up with some pretty cool opportunities. And definitely some of my DePaul and Lake Forest students didn't have that waiting for them. But the thing is, sometimes that was also really motivating, because they knew they had to make the best out of college, and they were there to play. And one of my favorite former students from Worcester, who's a young woman I know through Albany Park Theater Project, which is a neighborhood-based theater project that works with really diverse young people in Chicago. And a lot of young people from there ended up at Worcester. And this young woman who went to Worcester is now the assistant director of the company, went back to Chicago and works in this theater company, talked about how she would wake up her roommate who would want to sleep through class and be like, don't you know how incredible it is that we get to go to college? Because that was her perspective as a first-gen kid from Chicago. Her mom cleaned houses for a living, and she was so excited to be in college and to have financial aid and be at Worcester. And her roommate would want to sleep through her morning class. And this young woman was like, how can you sleep through class? This is such an incredible opportunity. And so I do think there's some of that going on too, when young people know that this is their shot.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So, to come back to these scripts though, I mean, one of the really compassionate thing about this book is you acknowledge how hard it is to talk to your kids about money, and how painful it might be to feel like you're the crusher of their dreams. Like maybe they always did want to go to Northwestern, or they always did want to go to Stanford, and you don't know how you could possibly pay for that, or circumstances have changed. Maybe they, went to private school, but now you're getting a divorce, or some other life situation has changed, and, their sibling has needed special care, and you're in a situation where money is more of a factor than you realized it would be, and you haven't talked to them. So can you talk a little bit about how to have those conversations? Because that's one of the things you did really well in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried really hard at that. So I guess, first of all, you and your spouse, if you have one, or your ex, if you've got one of those, certainly, or if you're flying solo in this parenting thing, find a friend who knows more about this process than you, or even a trained professional who you pay to set you straight, right? And sit down and have a realistic conversation about what it is that this might cost, what the range of possible outcomes are in terms of bottom line prices. Talk about what you think your ability to pay might be. And then talk about what your willingness to pay is, or your willingness to borrow, because there might be a gap between those two things for any number of reasons that, I'm not about to judge people But the fact of the matter is that even two, extremely happily married, well-matched or well-divorced people may have wildly different views on what is appropriate. And if you have not yet broached that topic yet, or really reckoned with it in a financially or emotionally honest way with yourself, let alone with your partner in parenting, you've got to do that first, right? It doesn't make sense to work that out in front of your kid who is already stressed out, confused, and maybe has never had a serious money conversation with you before about something that that matters so much, right? So best to get your own act together. That doesn't mean that you are morally obliged to pay for all of this or most of it, right? But you are morally obliged to give your kid a heads up well ahead in time about what they can expect from you, if anything, right? And if the answer is you can't pay a cent because of the circumstances that you have found yourself in for any number of reasons, because of any number of things that have happened to you, that's okay too, right? You are not alone. There are lots of people who are in that situation, and their kids do get to and through college as well. It makes it harder. It might take longer. But I think the sooner the kids know the reality of their situation, the better, right? So how soon, you may ask? Well, to my mind, the best time to tell them is before high school actually starts.
Wow.
Which I know is
a dinner table near us.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I've gotten in so much trouble for this already. All of, adolescent psychologist Twitter is really pissed off at me. But this is really, kind of the worst of two situations, right? Because you basically have two choices. I mean, it's on a continuum, but you've got two choices, right? You can figure out how this system works. You can reckon with your own ability and willingness to pay and borrow, and you can communicate that to your child before high school starts, or you can wait, right? And if you wait until junior or senior year, you may have a little bit more clarity. But, if the answer to the question is, wow, I should have gotten better grades so I could have earned more merit aid, so I could have had, bigger discounts at more selective institutions, right? If that ends up being the moral of the story, and you didn't explain that to your kid ahead of time because you thought it would stress them out or make them sad or make them mad at you, they're going to be really pissed at you right then, right? Like, what do you mean you were trying to shield me from all of this? This was information that would have been useful and might have changed the way, I behaved and conducted myself.
And this is a really nice through line to Opposite of Spoiled, where you talk about how kids will do anything to find out things like how much your house is worth or what parents earn. Many times it's a click away in any case. So kids with some basic internet skills can find out this information. But I certainly had the moment of, I had no idea how much my parents made when I applied to college until I did the college financial aid forms. And that's when I learned that the tuition was higher than my mother's salary, who worked full time. And that was such a mind-blowing moment for me in many ways, to understand that even in the 90s, college tuition could be, and of course now, many, many people earn less than their kids to college tuition. But that was kind of a little shock to my very sheltered mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's still the case that the median household income is less than, the rack rate at dozens and dozens of private colleges and universities. So, what does that tell you about how things work? But yes, I'm glad you brought that up, this whole one click away thing, because if you think that you can hide this information from them or just like put your head in the sand and not deal with it, you've got another thing coming, because, they've got older siblings, or they've got older friends, or they're reading the walls at the college office, right? Or this is happening already to my ninth grader. She's being served Instagram ads from some of these colleges. Somehow they found her. It isn't that hard to find her, turns out. And then, when she takes the PSAT next year, she's going to be bombarded with more mail. And, some of this stuff, I mean, the come-ons are unbelievable. The Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, sends out these emails with the subject heading, "Show me the money," right? So, if you think they weren't thinking about how this was all going to be paid for and what the price might be, I think you've got another thing coming, right? So better to be upfront about it. Don't hide anything from them. Doesn't mean it has to be a high pressure conversation. I mean, the beauty of the American system, if any of it is beautiful, is that there's a whole lot of choice, right? You can go to the DePauls and you can go to the Lake Forest colleges and you can go to Northwesterns, and Dr. Heitners are going to be everywhere. In fact, Dr. Heitner might be at all three of those places at once because of our nutty system of relying on adjunct contingent labor, where the Dr. Heitners have to work all three places at once in the same semester, sometimes earning $3,000 per course just to keep a roof over her head.
I never did that, but I knew people who did. And I appreciate that you talked about those factors and really talked about sort of value and like where the good teaching is and where young people get access to professors and get to do research with professors, and even what are the incentives for professors in these different schools, and what does that look like versus, at a liberal arts college, at a, land grant university, at a state, at different kinds of schools. And to understand also, I really appreciated how you wrote about honors colleges too, because I think it's one of the things I've always been curious about, like, Rutgers or Minnesota or some of these schools that have these really robust honors colleges. But I've interviewed a lot of parents whose young people didn't make it through. And so it was great to read those stats to see how few people who start in the honors college actually finish. Like I interviewed a mom who was had her kid at the University of Iowa, and I think he didn't even make it through to the second semester. So it was a very brief, but it still was enough to lure this new Trier grad, to Iowa.
Yeah. So, so the beauty of this system, is that there are a couple thousand choices for, residential undergraduate education. And, if your kid, tries really hard, tries their best, and still doesn't turn out to be a straight A or straight A- student in high school, that's okay. There are all sorts of great places where they can go, and where they may get merit aid discounts. That we'll be happy to have them as a B+ high school student. But for kids who are particularly ambitious and want to aim high, I think it's important that they know ahead of time exactly how much money will end up being a factor, both in what their family is able to provide, and how the schools will hand out discounts based on how these kids conduct themselves throughout high school. It just seems crazy to me that you would, set them adrift in a system, playing a game where the rules are not apparent to them or explained until after it's mostly over. That seems to me to be a worse situation than potentially stressing them out at the end of 8th grade when you explain how all this works.
Right. And here we are in, virtually in Illinois with Barbara's bookstore. And I know that the main bookstore branch that we're speaking from is Vernon Hills. So I'm picturing Vernon Hills High School, which I've been to, I think, a couple times. And I'm picturing an Instagram class. And I know a lot of the suburban high schools around here, there's an Instagram of the senior class, and you see everybody in their college sweatshirt, sort of one at a time. And there's a post, right? And it'll be like, this person's going to Illinois Wesleyan, and this person's going to Knox, and this person's going to Cal Poly. And wouldn't it be cool if it also said, this person's going to Cal Poly and their aunt is paying for it, and this person is going to art school and they're going to have $72,000 of debt, and this person. So if it wasn't just the kid in the sweatshirt, and I totally get and really feel for the classes of 2020 and 2021, and I'm like, if that sweatshirt moment brings you joy, you all have been, robbed. If there's any kids watching this, any high school students, like, this has been a really crap year or two for you all. So like, if that sweatshirt moments brings you joy, I'm not trying to take that away, but it would be nice if there was a little unpacking of that.
Yeah. So, as much joy as that can bring for, any number of students, and I too do not wish to rob them of joy, particularly this year, there's all sorts of super intense attempts to decode that information by the juniors and their parents and the sophomores, right? And then there's all of this conversation about Well, yeah, he got into Cornell, but his mom and dad met at Cornell as undergraduates, right? And they're rich and they give a lot of money, right? Or yeah, that one's going to Pomona, but it turns out that she's an incredible diver and she was a recruited athlete there, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't get any of those asterisks either. And I get that the Instagram stuff in particular is supposed to be celebratory, but just sort of plain anonymized lists of the schools where kids are matriculating. I find those deeply problematic for the reasons we've discussed and others. And I just may have something to say about it in public sooner rather than later. So you read my mind. Yeah.
Naviance also, I find, can be really crushing, and it also can encourage kids to only apply like where other kids in their high schools apply, and not because they want to see how they compare with those other people. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of, anyway, if parents have questions about that.
Right. Yeah. Naviance is the software a lot of college counselors use, and it can sort of place you and your statistics on a grid and give you a sense of, what has happened to other kids from your school who have statistics like you or unlike you, and whether they got in or not in previous years. So it, attempts to provide some sort of predictability. But, in a year like this one and last one, I mean, all these numbers and algorithms don't mean anywhere near as much as they might in more normal years.
So I'd love to open it up to folks who are here with questions. And again, I want to remind folks to get Ron's book from Barbara's with your 10% off and the green button. And if you already have it, bring it to an event with him live. I'm sure at some point he'll be back on the road and you can have him sign the book. If this book also makes an incredible gift for families. So if you want to gift this to friends with kids in middle school or early in high school, would be a great time to get it. But anytime, anyone with kids or who might be paying for college will really appreciate the reporting in this book. Questions are questions coming in. I'm just looking to see if I can see them at the bottom somewhere. Ask a question. Otherwise, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about what were the things that most surprised you that administrators revealed, especially around some of these decisions, or you got a lot of really good transparency out of some of these college folks you talked to.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm just thinking about, the people I talked to and some of what they revealed, I think there's a lot of fear, right? Every year or two, another institution that you would never would have thought of as one that, sort of hurting for students has had to start, paying smart kids to come, has had to, start offering merit aid. A couple of years ago, it was Connecticut College in Connecticut, part of the NESCAC athletic conference. And wow, were the lacrosse coaches at Bates College, upset when Connecticut College started doing this, right? Because it makes it harder to recruit, kids from $250,000 earning families that aren't going to earn much of any need-based aid. When Connecticut College is throwing around $20,000 or $25,000 merit aid packages, it can be worth $100,000 over 4 years per kid in discount. So it's hard to compete against that. And I was up in Minnesota. Every small liberal arts college in Minnesota offers merit aid now, except for Carleton College. They have managed so far to stay above it all. They are the only small liberal arts college in the entire Midwest. Yes, that's right. The only small liberal arts college in the entire Midwest that's not doing merit aid. And when I got in there, with their president and, got up within like 5 feet of him and asked him, I said, how close are you to having to do this? And I could see the fear in his eyes, right? Dear. I could see that he was worried that his day was coming. Carleton, right? And sort of a mainstay of the, top 5 U.S. News, best small liberal arts colleges in the nation list. And I think they feel like they're close. And so, Then
I thought you were
again,
going to bring up solvency in general when you said, like, what you might find out, because that's the other thing, is what colleges aren't going to make it through COVID. And I remember when I was at Lake Forest, let's say there was at least one other college in the ACM that wasn't doing so hot. And I remember that friends, had kids applying to that other school in the ACM that might not have made it through. And we all really, I felt like I had to say something to the parents, like, I'm concerned that this school might not be there in 2 years.
yeah,
Thankfully, they did pull through and they're doing okay, but that's a really scary thing to contemplate.
it is. It's a really hard thing to predict. And so how would you even go about doing that, right? I mean, there are a few public entities like Forbes. Forbes every couple of years tries to measure the financial health of institutions. But that doesn't necessarily mean the ones that get the lowest grade are on death watch. And then sometimes schools announce closures, and the faculty rally around, right? Look what happened at Hampshire College a handful of years ago, or Sweetbriar several years ago, right? All these alumni came out of the woodwork and raised a bunch of money, and they reversed the decision, right? So it turns out it's hard to kill a school that you have heard of, that has a reputation beyond 100 miles or 250 miles. And so I think what we're more likely to see is sort of like preemptive, prophylactic, restructurings, like what they're doing at Ithaca College right now. Like, that board sat and huddled for a couple of years and realized they needed to retrench pretty dramatically. George Washington did the same thing. George Washington decided it was going to shrink, right? That it might actually be possible and prudent to shrink to greatness. Because certainly none of these institutions grow, right? Growing, for the most part, seems leads to a decline in selectivity. So it's difficult to grow and do so in a way that makes financial sense. Unless you're offering a highly differentiated product, say like High Point University in North Carolina, which is sort of shiny and new and very pre-professional. They've managed to grow from 1,500 to 4,500 in the space of about 15 years. They've gotten a lot of people to borrow a lot of money to go to school there.
I think the land grabs have been interesting to watch. I mean, as an Evanston resident watching Northwestern, but also my undergraduate school was the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and they've bought up downtown all these buildings, right, in Columbia College, Chicago. And then, the real estate crash was very hard. And I don't know how that's going for those schools' bottom lines. I mean, they're still there too, but it's been very rough. I think these schools, in places like New York City or Boston or San Francisco that bought real estate in very inflated markets. That's a whole other.
Yeah, I mean, time will tell. It's become clear, at least for the last 10 or 15 years, that undergraduates are much more interested in, or are ever more interested in, going to college and living in an urban area for 4 years. And so, I would not bet against the, Columbia Colleges of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute. And I mean, look at what Northeastern has done in just a generation. It's turned itself from a, sort of commuter school afterthought into a school that, accepts a teen percentage of its applicants and, offers a highly differentiated product with its co-op program, right at the moment when people are questioning, return on investment, right? And, how much, real experience in the world is my kid going to have after 4 years? And at a co-op school, it turns out they're going to have a lot of real experience.
So another group of people that you advise us that we can maybe talk to as parents looking at this incredibly expensive bill, if we're lucky enough to have our own parents living and our kid has grandparents. And I just so appreciated that, because I'm in that somewhat privileged position in that my son is my only child and my father's only grandchild. And my father had kind of made noises about, maybe I'll be able to be helpful, but we hadn't had really deep talks about it. And my father's not super wealthy, so I didn't assume that he was just going to say, like, write a check for 4 years of college. But he does have a pension, which is one of those cool 20th century things that some people have that none of us will have. So I did, after reading your book, say, you know what, I need to talk to Grandpa Howard and say, you know what, Grandpa Howard, it's going to be really helpful if you can break it down for me a little more specifically. I don't need to know everything. If you don't know yet, that's fine. And, our kid is only 11, But if you could tell me a little bit more of what you have in mind, that would be really helpful so we can plan around it.
And how'd that go? I mean, you don't have to talk numbers.
It was a
if you
good
don't want to,
conversation,
but...
and you know, he was very clear with me that he wouldn't be able to help with everything, but that he had been saving in 529 in my son's name, which I did not know, and he did give me $1.
Wait, so it was only because you read the book that you had the conversation that he revealed
buy this book. Because I'd been kind of uncomfortable asking my dad this awkward question of like, so he said, we have
tell him that Ron Lieber made me ask you.
Yes, I said it was because my dad's a big New York Times reader. So I did say, actually, a New York Times reporter suggested that we'd have this conversation. And because we haven't had a lot of talks about money, even when my dad was paying for me to go to art school, he actually did. A really funny thing about my dad, who did pay for me to go to art school, my dad that I referred to earlier was from graduate school. So my parents paid for undergrad. So I was very lucky. And then I went to grad school and, you know, racked up some debt getting my doctorate. But my dad came to my art school graduation and was a really great speaker. And it was in the Medina Temple before they knocked that down. And the person who wrote and directed Angels in America, Tony Kushner, was the graduation speaker. And my dad said, you know, I didn't know you were getting a degree. I didn't know they give degrees at art school. So I said, you've been paying my tuition for 3 years. And you didn't know I was getting a bachelor's degree. So that was a lot of trust. Like,
that's incredible.
Paying this tuition, not even knowing I was getting a degree. He's a scientist. I guess it was so outside of his experience that he didn't know that there was an actual degree involved, that I would get a piece of paper that said Bachelor of Fine Arts.
Well, it makes my day to know that you had that conversation with him as a result of reading the book. And I encourage everybody to have the conversation. It is not money grubbing or ungrateful or ungracious to ask the question. And I mean, hey, let's put a news peg to it too. I mean, if you're in a slightly more affluent family than most, or you're not sure what your parent or parents have, it sure looks like we're going to get some kind of tax policy changes here, before President Biden is done with us. And chances are, the estate tax is going to change in such a way that it will be more advantageous to give money away while you are alive or pay for things for people in your family than it will be to hang on to it and have it in your name when you're dead. And so all the more reason, to have the conversation while it's on the brain, while people are thinking about avoiding the tax man upon their demise.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love another question that I thought about a lot before I read your book, because I knew some really smart people I really admired who did go to college abroad, who are our generation. And my cousin's partner went to college in Scotland. I knew several people who'd gone to McGill who've done really well. And my son's pediatrician happened to go there. So we've had these conversations somehow. And I thought, what a great idea. But the pandemic has really brought up a lot of questions about, would I be willing to do that, or what would that mean, right? Like, our friends who have kids at McGill now, they weren't sure if they were going to be able to get back into Quebec. It wasn't clear what was going to happen. So should we all look to Europe and Canada and pretty much anywhere else in the world where college is more affordable, or is that a good idea?
It's absolutely worth taking a look. But here's what people often don't understand. The farther you get from the United States of America, the less the undergraduate system looks like ours. Namely, that you're often entering into a sort of prescribed and somewhat narrow line of study. And you can't just change majors. It doesn't really work like that. You're more often than not, admitted into a program, into a school that really only does one thing or one reasonably small set of things. So they're not big on letting people change their mind. All of the, sort of scaffolding and social infrastructure that exists around undergraduate education here in the United States often does not exist abroad. No counseling center, no, clergy, no career office, hooking you up with internships and helping you figure out, sort of dizzying, confusing visa requirements, right? Maybe not much of a system in place to provide, entertainment or social opportunities. There may not even be dormitories, right? Maybe there's an apartment building nearby where a lot of people live, and you've got to figure out how leases work in Belgium and,
Right. So
shop
it's a
in
little bit of a you get what you pay for.
yeah, right. So it's like, for some 18-year-olds, that'll be the biggest adventure ever and it'll be fabulous. And, they don't need the mental health counseling center and they're going to come work for your family business when they're done. And so it's all great. And then other people will go and just not be able to handle it and maybe not be aware of what it is they're getting into. So just make sure you know exactly how things work.
Well, that career center and that counseling center are both things that you talk about in the book. And I know we're needing to wrap up in a moment, but you give a really good rubric for looking very hard at both what counseling is available and also what career services are available and how to kind of evaluate that, and not in the sense of just going to a school like maybe Columbia University in New York, where you drop your CV in a box at the end of school and somebody picks it up and hires you to work for a fancy consulting firm. But schools where, and people who, they want to go to Vassar and major in dance history, and then they need to figure out what to do with that,
Right. Yeah. So there are 2 chapters in The Price You Pay for College. One each on evaluating a college's counseling center, for mental health, and evaluating its career counseling center. So here's the thing you need to know about both those things. There is an epidemic of mental health troubles and needs on campuses, and more often than not, the mental health resources, to the extent that they exist, it's just oversubscribed, right? There's more demand than there is supply. And that means you may wait to see a therapist. There may be a cap on the number of times you can visit in a semester. And if you are far from an urban area, even if you are in an urban area, it can be difficult to get a referral to someone nearby, particularly if you have specialized needs. And so ask some hard questions about that. I mean, there are students going on strike, like walking out of class right and left, complaining about the inadequacy of the mental health operations at these schools. Now, you can only blame these institutions so much, right? Their core competency was never meant to be to provide mental health care. We can't do it very well as a nation. I don't know how well we can expect, these individual institutions to do it either. But you should be aware of it. And you should ask some hard questions about it. As far as the career counseling centers go, every single undergraduate institution has claimed to, blow theirs to smithereens in the last 10 or 15 years and rebuild it from scratch. So one good way to test these places and, how data-driven they are and outcomes-driven is to, waltz into the career counseling center like you own the place and say, hey, I'm thinking about going to school here. Can I see, your the most recent report on, what's happened to people after they graduate within 6 months? And, my kid's interested in being a religion major, a physics major. So can I just see the list of outcomes for all of the religion majors and physics majors, from last year's graduating class, and see what they say, see what they have. This is not just me being obnoxious. The head of career counseling at Macalester College said, by all means, come in and ask me for that. I'll hand it to you straight away. And if a school won't, they're probably doing it wrong. So, you don't just have my permission. You have permission from an insider to go ask about it. Okay, so before we go, I see one question has come in from Louisa. She wants to know, how hard is it for an adult to return to college post-pandemic? So I don't think the pandemic really has all that much to do with it. The fact of the matter is that it can be quite hard for an adult to return full time, if only for financial reasons, right? If you've got other things in your life that you need to support or pay for, that's hard if you're going to be commuting. And so I'd say the best thing that you can do is figure out which school seems most interesting to you, whether it's because of geography, subject matter interest, whatever it is. And go to that school and essentially try to make yourself a new best friend, right? Look at the website, see if you can learn something about the backgrounds of the people who work in the admissions office or the financial aid office. Look them up on LinkedIn, see if you've got any, source of commonality with them. And then write that person and just essentially throw yourself at their mercy. Say, hey, I've been out in the workforce for a while, never went to college or didn't finish when I did go. And I decided it's finally time. But I don't have a lot of money. Maybe I have a kid. and I don't really know how the system works, but I'm determined to do this. And would you please help me? People who do this work love to get notes like that from motivated students or prospective students who are determined to, sort of take this experience by the horns and kind of pull their way through. And so try to make a contact with a real human being at the institution that you seem to be most interested in now, and ask them what you can expect, right? How it works, how much you might have to borrow. Ask them to give you a realistic view of it. And then you'll know a lot more after that conversation than you did before it, and you'll probably have some next steps to follow.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, this book is a great example of and an argument for transparency within our families about money, transparency when we go to talk to these colleges, transparency that we need these institutions to provide about their practices so we can make the best decisions. And it's incredible reporting. It's really, really great read. So, and you can read it in little chunks, every day. You can just read one short chapter. Thank you so much for being with us, Ron, and answering these great questions. And the replay will be live on YouTube. And I think we are rolling out. So good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks to you, Professor Heitner. And thanks to all of you Chicagoans. I love being with my fellow Midwesterners always. And I hope we can do it again when the paperback comes out next year. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.